Hello, everybody. So today we'll be interviewing Dr. Daniel Bell, who's professor of philosophy at Hong Kong University. So we'll begin with the first question, which is, could you explain what got you interested in philosophy?
Well, so there's two senses of being interested, right? One is just a general interest, and the other is when I decided to make it into a career.
Yeah.
And the general interest part, I guess I had that from an early age, not as early as you. We were just
Mm.
speaking, and you said you had it starting from age 9, but
Yeah.
maybe for me it was 15 or 16 when browsing through books. I found the ones that were on philosophy quite interesting. But for
Mm.
my major, which was at McGill as an undergraduate, I actually chose psychology. Maybe in retrospect, it was a personal reason because my mother had a bit of mental instability and I wanted to understand her, I guess. But I did take courses in philosophy as well, starting my first year. And I found them interesting, but not to the point that, wow, this is my real passion and plan that I want to
Yeah.
pursue. But it only happened in my last year as an undergraduate at McGill when I took two courses. One was with Charles Taylor, who's a very famous philosopher, on the ancient Greeks. We looked at Plato's Republic and the ethics of Aristotle. And he was a really brilliant teacher. And actually, it's not just me, but quite a few people who took his courses at McGill went on to do that as a full-time career.
Oh, wow.
And I also took courses with James Tully, who was also an excellent teacher, on Marx and Bakunin. And I realized that what really interested me most in philosophy was really political philosophy, of course, with ethics as a background, rather than other forms of philosophy. And that's more or less when I decided to switch my major, I guess. So I applied to Oxford. There was an MPhil in politics with a lot of political theory that was specifically designed for those without much experience. And luckily, I was accepted, and that basically put me on the path to become a political theorist or political philosopher, whatever language you want to use. Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's great. So would you say there was like a particular philosophy that you learned about which particularly stimulated your interest in philosophy?
Well, so when I was in psychology, what really frustrated me at McGill in those days, which was the 1982 to 85, it was very scientific in approach,
Mm.
and we were and we had to we but I found that there were often assumptions about the good life that were kind of unstated, and also political assumptions about capitalism being a good thing that were not stated. And that frustrated me a little bit. So I was much more interested in a normative outlook about how things ought to be and how politics ought to be structured. And those questions were only asked when I took those courses with Charles Taylor and James Tully in my last year as an undergrad at McGill. Yeah. So now psychology is a much more interesting field. There's a lot about comparative psychology and this view that our assumptions there's this acronym weird and excellent assumption about an excellent acronym about how the way that we carry out psychological experiments often rely on the assumptions and values of
Mm.
Western educated industrialized. I don't remember the whole acronym. But in those days, these questions were not relevant in psychology. So maybe if I had taken psychology now, I would have stuck with it. But in those days, I changed. Yeah.
Mm. So for you, it's just because you were curious about the underlying assumptions behind these established scientific ideas and you wanted to look deeper into them?
Yeah, the kind of normative assumptions that
Yeah.
underpinned a lot of social science. I mean, that's what really interested me. And then finally, yeah, exactly.
Mm. That's very interesting. I guess we'll move on to the next question. What do you enjoy most about your career?
So as an academic, I mean, people won't be surprised to hear there's three main components: research, teaching, and service. And so the research part is the most difficult, but in many ways the most rewarding. I mean, some people find writing enjoying. I don't particularly enjoy it. I don't find it that painful, but it's not a great source of pleasure. I mean, it's only after things are published when people start to engage with what I write. Of course, that's very rewarding. I mean, I get lots of negative reviews of my books as well. I mean, those are not particularly enjoyable, but I don't mind constructive. In fact, not only do I not mind, I very much enjoy constructive criticism that pushes things further. That's a huge source of pleasure. For teaching, I guess the biggest reward is when, obviously, I mean, nothing particularly new there, when students engage with the ideas and come up with 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 ways of thinking that they hadn't thought of before. But again, my point is not, I'm very much influenced by Confucianism now. My point is not to knock down tradition and replace it with something new. I mean, often a lot of it involves recovering previous assumptions and ideals that are embedded in their way of life and that have a much longer tradition. If I could bring some of that to light and then allow them, the students, to think of how to interpret and innovate in new ways, of course, that's very rewarding as well. Now, so one of the kind of central assumptions of Confucianism is that the good life involves, I mean, we're going to move on to that question now, but
Yeah.
so let me, well, why don't you ask it now and then I'll.
Yeah, so the next question is, in your opinion, what are the defining beliefs of Confucianism?
Yeah, so Confucianism, it's what really makes Confucianism is that into a living tradition is that it's always adapted and changed in response to engagement with other traditions. I mean, in the very early days, with Taoism and legalism and Moism, and then eventually with Buddhism, and then more recently with liberalism, with Christianity, with democracy, with capitalism. So there's always been this constant change and innovation within the Confucian tradition, and there's hugely diverse strands. That said, I think there are really central assumptions that you have to hold, and if you don't hold those, it's hard to be a Confucian. One is a view about the good life, that it involves nourishing, I'm going to simplify here, but let me go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
Nourishing humane and harmonious social relations. So there's two central values here: humane meaning ren, the character is like this, and basically it's usually sometimes tried as benevolence or humaneness. So you're involved in social relations that should be humane and compassionate. And two is that they should be characterized by harmony. But again, the Confucian idea of harmony is he. It often has a misleading connotation in English, because for almost every Chinese intellectual knows this saying from the Analects of Confucius, that 君子和而不同, meaning that exemplary persons pursue he, and he here is really, we can translate it best as diversity within harmony, rather than tong, which is conformity or sameness.
Yeah.
So the social relations that Confucians defend and celebrate involve a kind of diversity and respect for diversity, rather than wanting everyone to fit into these predefined and set for eternity roles. So that's a good life. And again, it contrasts with other versions of the good life, right? I mean, think of Plato's Republic, where the best life involves leaving the cave, where you contemplate forms, or you do purely what we would say today like abstract philosophy. And it's only as a second choice that you'd go back in the cave to try to engage with the public and the community. Or some forms of philosophy also strongly value an autonomous life that doesn't involve, and it may or may not involve, social relations, but most important is to be autonomous first and foremost. But no, for the Confucians, it's really central to leading the good life is that it involves humane and harmonious social relations. But there's also a view about what the best life involves. And the best life is one where you serve others and you serve the community in the capacity of a public official. Again, I mean, you have diverse strands of Confucian, but I think it's quite central to the Confucian tradition, and also the way that Confucians understand themselves, that if you have an opportunity to serve the public in a compassionate way, then you should take that opportunity, because if you have the power to do good, you should try to do good. Of course, in bad times, then there's no hope, maybe, then you should withdraw and do poetry or become a Taoist or whatever. I mean, that's also consistent with Confucian. But if there's any hope of social and political progress, then you should try to serve the community as a public official. So to get back to your earlier question, I mentioned the third component of being an academic is service, right? So you have teaching, you have you have research and you have service. And for the kind of Confucian influenced academic, the idea that you would serve first the community, sorry, the university as a kind of public official, that's really central to the ways of thinking of academics who are influenced by the Confucian tradition. That's why in Shandong province, which is the home ground of Confucianism, perhaps more than other parts of China, there's really strict, I mean, let's use the word competition to be an administrator in a university. Even excellent academics would rather forsake their research for a while if they have this chance to be a dean or vice president or president or even something higher. So that view kind of influenced me. So when I was given the opportunity to serve as dean at Shandong University, it was a large school of political science and public administration. We had 80 professors and about 1,000 students. And it was a descendant of Confucius, Xing Kong. So Kong in Chinese is, Kongzi is Confucius. It was a 76th generation descendant of Kongzi, who was the party secretary at the new campus of Shandong University in Qingdao. And he offered me or strongly encouraged me to accept the post of dean at Shandong University. And it was a real opportunity to serve as a public official. And it was a great honor for me to do that. Of course, things didn't always go as planned, and I ended up writing a book based on my experience called The Dean of Shandong. Yeah, I didn't choose a title. A better title, there's a Chinese translation in Hong Kong. I speak Mandarin rather than Cantonese, called 在山东当院长. Basically, in Shandong, I was a dean among many, because in English the title is a bit misleading. The Dean of Shandong is as though there's only one dean. But anyway, the subtitle is Confessions of a Minor Bureaucrat at a Chinese University, which says a little bit about the light-hearted way of writing the book. It was very serious themes like Confucianism, bureaucracy, communism, but for some strange reason I wrote it in a light-hearted way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's pretty interesting, like talking about service as a component of academia and Confucianism in general. Yeah.
And you have huge cultural differences, because in the US, for example, I'm Canadian, but let me just report, it's similar in Canada. At leading universities, most researchers would prefer to do their own research. And if they serve as head of department or as dean, it's not something they want to do. It's like a responsibility that they have to do. Like I remember once I was at Stanford at his professor's home, he picked up the phone and he screamed in joy. And I said, "What happened? What happened?" And he said, "I do not have to serve as head of department." So he was very happy to be relieved of that post. But in mainland China, perhaps, especially in Shandong province, you'd have almost the opposite reaction. If you're offered a post, you'd want to take it, because the idea of serving the community is really central to the Confucian ethic.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes against like this stereotype that academics just work in like the ivory tower, like away from society, away from their communities, and just like work by themselves. But I think giving back to their communities and giving back to the people who brought them to who they are is quite nice.
Sure, that's well put. Of course, an academic, who is not head of department might say, "Well, my research serves the community because some people work on quite practical problems, and they might think that's a way of service as well." But for the Confucians, it's really through being a public official. That's the way to serve the community. Yeah.
I think what you said about like diversity as defining like the idea of Confucian harmony is quite interesting, because I always thought that in Confucianism there's this idea of trying to conform to roles that were prescribed to you by society, but then I think being accepting of diversity within that is much better.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a kind of, Roger Ames calls it a role ethics, where you have certain roles that are there, often unchosen, and sometimes you should strive to do your best to act in the capacity of that role. But again, within those constraints, you have huge amounts of diversity and arguments about what's the best way of being a good teacher or a good parent or a filial son or daughter.
Yeah. I guess this kind of leads on to the next question, which is, can social hierarchies prescribed by Confucianism, like filial piety, coexist with ideals of equality?
So, well, there's two ways. One is that so I wrote with a fellow scholar at University of Hong Kong called Wong
Mm,
Pei. We wrote a book called Just Hierarchy. And basically, we argue that hierarchy, of course, our views are influenced by Confucianism, that the hierarchies that are morally justified, hierarchies that involve humans, the ones that are morally justified, have to benefit to a certain extent, at least, those on the bottom of hierarchies, those with less power.
mm,
So if you think that filial piety or filiality, I think actually, so the Chinese term is xiao, and maybe a better translation is care and reverence for the elderly and ancestors. So it doesn't just, it's not just elderly, and it's not, and piety has a kind of religious connotation. So this term too might be a little bit mistranslated as filial piety. But anyway, um, how would it be morally justified? Well, obviously, if it means that children should blindly obey their parents, that's not morally justified, because that could
mm.
easily lead to oppression of children and cruelty towards children. And
Yeah.
if they need to blindly obey, parents who beat them and say harsh things and constantly discourage them, then that's a real distortion of the Confucian ideal of filial piety. So Confucians throughout history have gone out of their way to say that we don't mean blind obedience. I mean, even there's this text from the Qing dynasty, which is used now a lot in Chinese schools, called the Di Zigui, and it's really meant for young children, even like 5-year-old children. And they say, well, what happens if one of your parent does something wrong, morally wrong? What should you do? And the text says, well, first you should criticize them. And then what if that doesn't work? Well, then you wait till they're in a good mood and try again. And then what if that doesn't work? Well, then you cry and you work on their emotions. And what if that doesn't work? Well, then you have to take it. But basically, the point is that you have very detailed instructions for how to deal with parents who do something
Mm,
morally wrong. So the question is, how could filial piety be morally justified? Well, if it involves shifting roles, so whereas sometimes if an adult or an elderly or even an ancestor has more power and respect and reverence, well, then clearly there is a kind of power relation. But if those relations shift over time, then it could be morally justified over time. And so equality doesn't mean that we have to be equal at the same time every instant, right? If over time, for example, I'm a child and I have less power than my parent, but eventually I get older, and then I have more, power and respect than my own child. Then that form of there's a kind of equality over time, we can say. Um, Another way in which a hierarchical social relation might be compatible or might even actually promote forms of equality. Again, depends what I mean by equality, right? So if we assume that any society is going to have hierarchical relations, the question then is, well, how could, if we have some hierarchical relations, how might they promote uh, equality in other spheres of life? So, for example, if we have a relation where, like, let me just radically simplify, okay? In East Asian societies that have a strong Confucian culture, um, the social hierarchy, there tends to be a lot of hierarchy in social relations. I mean, think of Korea or Japan, where there's a bowing culture depending on the
mm,
age and social status of the person. You have that. Of course, China had a revolution, mainland China, and you have less of that, but still very much embedded in people's social relations that people with age have a lot of respect. But on the other hand, there's also a very strong uh, belief that economic relations should be relatively equal. So it's on the one hand, it seems paradoxical where you have strong hierarchical relations in terms of social norms, but yet when it comes to the distribution of wealth, you have a relatively equal distribution of wealth, for example, in Korea or Japan. And in China, of course, it's highly unequal, but there's still a very strong drive to make it more equal. So how can that be? Whereas, well, let's also look at the other, look at another society like the US, where people are often, in terms of social norms, I'm going to say superficially similar, right? For
mm,
example, if I were to meet Bill Gates, I would say, Mr. Gates, he might say, call me Bill. I say, okay, call me Bill, right? Well, but there's a huge inequality in terms of power because he has so much more money than me, right?
Yeah.
So in the US, on the one hand, there's a kind of strong emphasis on equality in terms of social norms, but on the other, or social relations, let's say. But yet, when it comes, there's also much more tolerance for economic inequality. So you really have to ask, maybe it's precisely because in East Asia that there is an acceptance and almost justification of hierarchy in social relations, that then you can also have a strong norm that favors equality in terms of the distribution of wealth. Maybe those with power, if you have symbolic power, like I'm treated, for example, if I'm elderly and have high social status, I'm treated well and with great respect, I might not have as much of a need to have more money to show my power. But in the US, on the other hand, if everybody calls you Bill and without much deference and respect, well, maybe then you might want to have more money to show your power. So this is one way in which, if you have inequality in terms of social relations, it might actually allow for a norm that favors more equality in terms of the distribution of wealth.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, like in the US, would you say there's like social hierarchies are more implicit? Like there's not these really tangible prescribed social hierarchies like in Confucian societies. So like for example, taking Bill Gates' example, like everyone would implicitly just know that he has much more money than all of us, but then like no one would really like talk about it, but then that would still be a power relation that exists between us, and that would make it much more harder to address and change.
Well, that's a good point. If the hierarchies are implicit, maybe you're right that it means that they're more difficult to change. But on the other hand, you have these different emphases on which hierarchies are justified and which are not. You might have cultural and historical reasons that themselves help to explain current outcomes, which also are very hard to change.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I guess we'll move on to the last question. What place do ancient Chinese philosophies like Confucianism have in contemporary Chinese society?
Well, so again, because Confucianism is a living tradition that constantly adapts through its engagement with other traditions, it's not a dead tradition, meaning that it influences people's ways of life, sometimes, and of course, more recently, with this huge Confucian comeback, it influences people's conscious self-understandings as well. So throughout much of the 20th century, the Confucian tradition was very much downgraded in terms of self-understandings. In fact, there was very much an anti-Confucian tradition, or to put it more broadly, there was this tradition of anti-traditionalism that took an extreme form in the Cultural Revolution when there was this effort to completely smash the four olds, meaning traditional ways of life, with Confucianism at its core. But that's widely regarded as a failure, as an overreaction. And since then, there's this effort to look at the tradition in a more charitable way. And there's different reasons why this change had happened. I mean, one is political, that I think the government realizes that its kind of values-based legitimacy shouldn't just come from Marxism, it should come from this longer civilizational way of life and culture with Confucianism at its core. There's also an economic reason that, and this many people realize that actually some Confucian values, at least in their kind of vulgarized form, like you should work hard, study hard, don't worry too much about the afterlife, are actually quite compatible with a kind of capitalist growth, which also helps explain why East Asian countries, not just China, have developed quite rapidly in a relatively peaceful way. But on the other hand, capitalism makes people more individualistic in a problematic way, and there's a need for an ethic to counter that. And the Confucian ethic of social responsibility is also a way to do that, which also explains the revival of Confucianism. It's also an academic revival, that people realize the tradition is so long and diverse and fascinating from an academic point of view, which also helps to explain its revival. So and there's very good social scientific research showing that you have these very important cultural differences between countries with a Confucian heritage and, for example, the United States. And that also helps to persuade people that there's much more going on here than just this kind of political manipulation of an old tradition, for example.
Mm. So would you say that Confucianism has survived throughout the ages and is just constantly adapting to the present sociocultural conditions of the time?
I think that's right, and I also think that some of the deeper or more constant values of Confucianism, as mentioned, they say that the good life lies in humane
Yeah.
and harmonious social relations. That those really capture something central about, and I don't like to use this term, but about well, let's use the term human flourishing. That's pretty constant, and that's not going to change. Um, I think that also helps explain the kind of long-lasting um, nature of the Confucian tradition.
That's great. So like Confucianism is a way of basically keeping everything in check. Like it doesn't make sure that capitalism makes everyone too individualistic, and it just ensures that society is still in balance.
Well, let's hope so. I mean, things could easily go wrong,
Yeah.
with AI and
Yeah.
war and climate change. But so
Yeah.
long as the world remains more or less hopeful for the future, I think Confucianism will have an important role to play.
Yeah, I think that's great. So thank you so much for the interview.
Okay, thanks for the